of you, if you take a look, thank you for looking ahead at the specifics. Some of you are going to be preparing it with 50% whole wheat or 25% whole wheat. We're not going to go 100% because that would dramatically change the workability of the dough. Can you do it at home? You definitely, what I always suggest is definitely giving it a try and going up in percentages. So see how you're like 50%, then try 75, then go 100 when you're ready. So the ingredients that we have here are the 2 packets of yeast. And if you remember from the chapter, yeast is going to come in a lot of different forms, right? Can anybody name some of the forms that we're going to get it? There's going to be fresh yeast, right, which comes in a cake form, and it has to be refrigerated. And then there's active dry and instant. Does anybody remember the difference between active dry and instant?
Active dry, we have to wait until it rises.
You want to wait until, well, you have to hydrate this. So the instant yeast, which is really cool, sometimes students will put the yeast into the flour without hydrating it in the water, and that can be a problem because then it can't, but instant yeast can go right into the flour, which makes it very nice to use if you're going to do like commercial stuff. Can I have a thermometer? Thanks, because this water actually feels quite warm. So all of the yeast that is in these type of packets, the first thing that you want to check is just the expiration. So this is April 15th, 2021. You really don't have to do what's called proofing the yeast, which is waiting to see if it bubbles. If you have this expiration date, you're pretty much safe when it comes to that. But you can take the extra step. I mean, bread making does take a good amount of time, right? So if you want to give it a check, you can wait to see if the bubbles will form here. So I have my, as you guys measured out for me, thank you, 4 cups of all-purpose flour, spooned and leveled, meaning we spoon it in, we level it off. Important, plus more for our work surface. Then we have 1.5 cups of warm water here, and we want this to 105, 110. In your textbook, you might see it go a little higher. I write 110 because I don't like to mess with anything too warm, because there's always the chance that, I don't know, something goes wrong, and with your thermometer, if you don't have a thermometer, you can do lukewarm. It's just going to take a little longer. So this is 95, so we're good. So 95 straight out of the tap is pretty warm. So this yeast here is in a state of dormancy, right? And dormancy, what is the definition of that?
Sleep.
Sleep. It's a state of inactivity, right? So it needs to be woken up, and just like you, right, in the morning, it needs a little warmth. It needs something to eat. It needs to be hydrated. It needs to drink. So we're going to give it this warm water, right? And it was 2 packets, which is a 1/4 ounce each. And there's 2 1/4 teaspoons in each packet if you ever have a big thing of yeast and it doesn't come in these packets, right? So active dry yeast here. And what you can do if you didn't have the expiration date for whatever reason, you would wait for the yeast to start bubbling. And what are those bubbles? Yes, right? Specifically what? Yes, CO2. So you want to make sure that it really fully dissolves. Okay. With just water and no fat, but we are going to be using a little olive oil. Not really, but I just wanted you to see this first before we went ahead. So this one was done, what would we say, about 5 minutes ago?
About 6,
More like 8 minutes ago. So we see the bubbles, we see some activity, but did you add the sugar to that? No, okay. So this recipe calls for sugar. This recipe has a lot of yeast and a lot of sugar, and it takes a quick rise. The reason why we do this in class is because by the time you make this dough, put plastic wrap on it and put it by your warm stove, you'll prep your ingredients, you'll come back and it will have risen. A lot of recipes that use less yeast or no sugar to kind of jumpstart the whole process can take 2 hours, or you're looking for doubling in bulk. How do you tell if something's doubled in bulk? If you put it in a bowl and it's halfway up, it'll be all the way to the top. What is another way that you can check to see that it's fully risen? By touching it, right? The poke test, right? So you can put 2 fingers in it, and if the indentation stays, it's ready. Now, we have salt and we have olive oil left over. For the olive oil, we have a 1/4 cup. And then for the salt, we have 2 teaspoons of coarse salt. So this isn't iodized salt because it is a lot, right? And kosher salt has less sodium, so this is kosher salt. Where do you think these are going to go?
Dry
Take a
and
guess.
dry and then wet.
Okay, so the dry with the dry, but we put the sugar in here. So we might think that maybe the salt would go in here, but the salt is not going to go in here because salt kills yeast, right? So we want to make sure that our salt goes in with the dry ingredients and we mix that up. Now this group has the 25% flour, so 25% whole wheat flour, so you can see that there at the bottom. So we're mixing that up, and then the olive oil, if we were to put it into here, would be in big clumps, so we don't want that. So this is going to go into our liquid. For many years, I did this lab here, and I did it at school, and I would buy pizza dough. I had like a hidden secret. And this recipe is what converted me because it comes together so quickly. I make it mostly in the summer, and in the summer, it rises in the warmth of the house, or you put it outside on the deck. It comes together so quickly. It's really very easy. Some pizza makers do a very long ferment, and they rise either overnight, or they sometimes do it for 48 hours, 72 hours, and it really develops flavor. Where does that flavor come from? It's releasing the fermentation, right? It's going to release CO2, and it's also going to release alcohol. So my students often the next day, because we don't have 5 hours, we only have 40 minutes, right? We do this dough. We don't worry about the warm water because we're not going to wait for it to rise in one sitting, and we do it overnight. We put it in a Ziploc bag. We come back the next day, and they open it up, and they're like, "Oh, it smells like beer. It smells like wine," and you will get that smell, and that smell imparts a lot of the flavor. So this is a messy job, right? So you're going to make a little well in the center, and you can do this in a mixer. But again, this recipe is so easy. You can do it in the bowl too.
You just pour all that yeast into.
Yep. So that had the olive oil, the sugar, the water. And I'm just using the wooden spoon here. And we talked a lot last week about gluten, right? And we really didn't want gluten to develop, right? We were making biscuits, we were making muffins, and I can mix that flour as much as I want. No gluten is going to form until it's hydrated, right? So as soon as that gluten gets wet, now the gliadin and the glutenin, when they get wet, they start to form the gluten. And the gluten is that web, right? That web that forms. And yeast now is going to release that CO2, and it's going to form that signature look inside the yeast dough. So at this point, you really want to have very clean hands because you're going in there with your hands. And this is the shaggy dough. And what does that mean? Really just this. It looks all shaggy. We saw that shaggy dough with the biscuits, remember? Right? And this is really how the biscuits should have looked when it went out onto the counter. And if you're doing this in a mixer, you keep kneading until the dough pulls away from the side of the bowl, right? This kind of dough with biscuits, I said it might not pick it all up, but with this kind of dough, it will pick it all up. Now this dough is going to be a little bit tougher because it has the whole wheat flour in it. And it's going to be a little less tender. It's also going to be a little darker in color, but you can use white whole wheat flour. So when we want to develop gluten, we do something called kneading. And if everybody could put their hands out like this for a second. Okay, what you're going to do with kneading is you're going to push with the heels of your hands. Okay, you're going to push out, and then you're going to fold your dough, and you're going to give it a turn. Now, I show it slowly. That doesn't mean that it has to go that, exact way. But you're turning, you're pushing, and this will be for a good 5 to 10 minutes. This dough, ironically, has so much yeast that it doesn't need to be kneaded as long as one that would have like maybe a teaspoon or something like that. So another reason why this recipe is really easy. So for the purpose of, just the demonstration, you're gonna keep going until it is elastic and smooth. You want elasticity. How do you know? When you pull it apart, it shouldn't pull apart. Okay, so you're gonna keep going with this until it doesn't really pull apart. And you're gonna keep, if it starts sticking to your hands, if you measure properly, there shouldn't be an issue. If you did not, you might need a little bit more flour. You can always add more flour. You can't go back now and add more liquid, right? So then this is going to go into an oiled bowl. You can rinse this one out and put a little bit of cooking spray in it, and you're gonna put plastic wrap on top of it. Put the plastic wrap on top so it's really nice and tight, and it will capture the CO2, and we will start to see it rise. It'll be really cool. And then we can do the poke test and see if it stays. See, I poked it and it's coming back, right? So if you poke it and it comes back, that's the elasticity. When it fills up with CO2, when you poke that, it will stay, and you'll feel it'll be a lot lighter. It's really dense and heavy right now. When it comes out, it's going to be beautiful and really nice to work with. Yes, so the salt is imperative in the yeast bread. You have to have it. You have to have it for flavoring, and also the yeast would grow out of control. You don't just directly add it to like the vulnerable stage where it's just the yeast and the salt. So throughout, you want it. You really can't make, it's very difficult to make bread without salt at all. You need that. You don't, on the other hand, have to have fat and sugar. That is something that's unique to this recipe. And like I said, we're doing this one because it rises very quickly, but there are many, many, many different recipes. We're gonna take this recipe tonight and turn it into a cinnamon bun, but traditionally cinnamon bun dough is yellow in color, and it has butter and egg and milk, and all of that fat and sugar in the dough slows down the fermentation process, and it takes a lot longer, and the rising takes a lot longer. Some of our dough, after it rises, is going to come out and go straight into the oven. Other recipes that we have are going to be rolled out, and they are going to proof. And that proofing is a second rising. So we're going to take our cinnamon buns, and they're going to be very, very, very tightly wound. And they're going to go in like this. And we're going to cover them in plastic wrap, and they're going to rise again, and they're going to fill the entire pan and become much lighter. Could you eat them at this first stage when it first goes into the oven? Yes, but they're not nearly as good and light and fluffy. So some of ours are going to have that second rise, which is called the proofing. So you guys can go ahead into your groups and make your dough, and then you can start prepping for your toppings.